Hi guys, today I would like to show you how to convert your API to a full-blown web application in under 15 minutes using a tool called DBF. Creating a full-blown application for an API is very useful to reach a bigger audience because only people who can code can use an API, but everyone can use an application. But it is very time consuming. You have to manage the user database, user workflow, design user interface and user experience, and let's not get started with the plan management and API limits. This can take weeks to months to develop, but not anymore. Thanks to DBF, you can have your very own application which is free to start, while avoiding all of the problems mentioned. Plus, you will have your own dashboard which you can use to monitor your API usage. I may need to put a little disclaimer here that it is still a work in progress, and you can review the public development backlog here. And I'll be sure if there's any major changes that will affect this tutorial, I'll be sure to update this tutorial and making it as relevant as possible. So before we get started with the tutorial, there is one critical assumption that I'm making is that you already have one public API endpoint. I have a public API endpoint, as you can see here. It's an API that I created. User takes an input, a link, any link, and the output is the social media links in that website. This is a Heroku app, but obviously Heroku is just one of the ways that you can do it. It can very well work with just an IP address. And for those who may concern, HTTPS is also optional. You don't have to create an HTTP endpoint. So the first thing you want to do, so maybe let's have an overview of how we can make an API. So there are 4 steps. The first step is to define the API endpoint. So this allows the platform to know our API endpoint and the possible parameters that we can take. And the second step is to define the project, or the project is also equivalent to an application. This is where we can define the project's name, project description, and the logo. And the third step is to define the different plans that this project supports. So if you can think like a pro plan or a freemium plan, we can define for each plan the different API limits, monthly limit, and the different prices that it can take. And finally, once we have defined the plan, the only thing left to do is to define the in-app pages. So the in-app pages refers to the pages that the users, your users, can use to interact with the API. So we'll get to it. We'll get to more details later, but just something to touch upon is that when I say in-app pages, I'm not referring to the login and register page and the forget password. All of those pages will be created automatically upon the creation of the pages. So the first thing you need to do is to create an account and activate your account. I already have an account, so I can just log in. And if you just created an account, you should see the same thing as what I'm seeing right now. You have the first step, as I mentioned, is to create your first API. So let's do this. The API name could be just fetch social links with the endpoint. The endpoint is anything that is before the parameter. Get method, you can put post if that's your API method, and the output type can either be JSON, chart, or table. So let's submit it. And here you go. We've done the first step, which is to define our API endpoint. So optionally, you can also define the default inputs. Let me do that. And this is useful so that we don't have to put the input like manually every time for all the pages. We can just import the default structure. So we can say the default inputs here is key is link with the name link. The key is what's going to be put into the URL, and the label is any label that you want that can be useful for the user to know what it is. And let's submit the default structure, and there you go. You should have your first API generated. As mentioned, you have your own dashboard where you can see the new users that signed up in your projects, the API usage. Right now we have none because obviously this is just a brand new API. So as mentioned here, the second step that we need to make is to create our first project. So let's click on it. The name can be anything you want. It can just let's make socialify because it's social links, and the UID here is a unique ID that you can use for your API for your application. So it's easier to see later once we start with it. So, but this is quite important. The description can be linked with the social links, and for this example, let's just make the icon as air balloon. Why not? And submit it. And if you go back to the dashboard, once you do that, you have your very first application. So now that we've created our application, as I mentioned, the third step is to define the plans for this application, which you can modify in the admin view of that project. So if you click on the admin view, in here you can clearly see there's different sections. The first we want to do is to manage project and define the different plans that we want. So let's make 3 plans. So for free, make the price to 0. The description would be just free trial. And for this, for this API, monthly limit could be just 100 calls per month to just social links. And then let's create another one, Pro, Pro for $10 per month. Let's make it for scalar. It's just a description that for the sake of this example. Submit, and before we have 100, so let's make this 500 to fetch social links. And finally, for the final plan, let's make it premium, and let's make this 25. Description would be for big enterprise, and let's make this monthly limit to 1000. And when you submit it, now you have 3 different plans for your project. So once you have defined your different plans that the user can take, the final step is to define the different in-app pages in your application, which you can access by here. You can create new. So in here you can see different fields. The page path will act as part of the URL. The name, let's make any name that you like. Let's make it API Playground. And there are different types of pages that you can define. You can create a playground, you can define batch pages, you can define dashboard, external link documents. With each page have their own functionalities. You can keep in mind that you can always refer to the documentation. You can do the documentation in the website to ask basically what are the different pages type. And finally, we can define the icon. Let's make it monitor and submit. And as you can see, after you create it, you can define that, okay, this page will have to use this API, and this button you can use to import the default structure which we defined in the first step, So by clicking this, you don't have to, you can imagine sometimes you can have like 5 different parameters. You don't want to do that every time. So by clicking this button, you will automatically import the default structure that you define. So let's save, and just like that, you have your very first page. So for that, let's try using the API playground, and there you go. You have the result of the API here, and that's it. So you have created your first application. So for fun, let's try to assume that now we are one of the user of this application. So how can we access this application, right? So as you can see, as I mentioned, the path parameters is part of the URL. So you can log out and you copy in here. And basically the path is your application is now running on the devbf.com/p/your path. And you can access and log in. You can do register as well, and you can have the register page. So let's try to create an account and assume that we are one of the users. So I just created an account as one of the users, so I can now log in. And as you can see, it has the different plans that we defined as the admin. We can take free plans, pro, premium, and if we take the free plans, for example, as a user, by default, you will have this really nice dashboard where you can have also your API usage to monitor. So that's it, guys. So do not hesitate to ask any questions if you may have any. I'm very responsive for my email address. I will put my email address in the description below. And I hope this is useful for someone, and I cannot wait to see what you guys will make. Thank you very much and have a good day.